like why deploy to Eclipse, or in particular our SVM L2 on Ethereum? I think that the number one reason is to access Ethereum users who in general are less price sensitive. So if you want the cheapest, absolute cheapest transactions, then you'd probably want to be on the Solana L1. But you get this free bridge, and Ethereum users are really going to like the idea of immediately benefiting from this highly parallelized virtual machine, which is the same as Solana. We get to borrow a lot of those great innovations that Tolly and the team have made, but then they also get to be within the ecosystem that they're comfortable with.
This episode is brought to you by Jito. Jito is the easiest way to start earning MEV rewards on Solana through liquid staking. Get your SOL, stake it with Jito, and get instant access to liquidity through their liquid staking token, Jito SOL. Get started today at jito.network/staking. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lightspeed. Today, we are joined by Neel Somani, the founder of Eclipse, and Nick White, the COO at Celestia. Neel and Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pumped to have you here. You probably know a lot of our listeners are from the Solana community, so they probably have heard the debate, modular versus monolithic, which we now call integrated, and we're going to get into why. But let's start on what a modular blockchain is, and by doing that, let's break down what a blockchain is into the four main functions. And Nick, do you mind starting there?
Sure, yeah, and I think integrated is a good rebrand. I think brands are really important, so credit to you guys for making that pivot. So the main difference between a modular blockchain and a monolithic or integrated blockchain is that in a modular blockchain or in a monolithic blockchain, you have coupled all the different functions that a blockchain has to perform into one single protocol, and all the nodes in that protocol have to perform all those functions. And in a modular blockchain, actually, you kind of boil it down into what those, you distill it into those separate functions, and then you say, okay, well, which ones need to be bundled together and run in a given a separate protocol, and then you can actually stack those protocols on top of each other, and you can build and have the same functionality of a fully complete blockchain, but with, in my opinion, lots and lots of benefits. So the three layers that are most important are data availability, consensus, and execution. And so data availability is an often misunderstood concept. It's not data storage. It's about publishing data. It's making sure that everyone in the network can actually see, the transactions that are taking place. Consensus is about ordering all those transactions. And then execution is about okay, now we have these transactions that have been published, so everyone knows what they are, they're ordered. Now we need to interpret those transactions and execute them and compute what is the actual state, the final state of the chain, given that all these transactions have taken place. And in our world, Celestia is a consensus and data availability layer on which people can launch their own custom execution layers as rollups. And so the advantage there is that you can customize the execution layer. You don't have to bootstrap an entirely new consensus network every time you want to launch a new chain. And you get this inherent sort of parallelism between these rollups. They don't end up sharing the same state with each other. So you can actually sort of fragment things in a way that is beneficial. And also another part of this that's really important, kind of a corollary, is that modular blockchains use data availability sampling to scale block space in a trust minimized way. And they also use fraud proofs and ZK proofs, which makes it possible to prove execution in a really scalable trust minimized way. So modular blockchains also inherently have this very powerful scaling property that you can achieve in a monolithic blockchain, but you have to implement those things in a monolithic way. So that's kind of the TLDR of modular versus monolithic integrated.
Yeah, and to add on to what Nick's saying, like he was saying at the end, there's nothing that's inherently not possible to build into Solana as an L1. But the difference of when you break all these pieces apart is now, one, you get to share infrastructure. Maybe I have an execution layer. I don't have to worry about building the remaining parts of the blockchain that I want to see. So I can use Celestia as a module. I can use Ethereum as some other module, and I can share some of the security properties of these blockchains. And the second part is just for developers as a whole, this is good, because when you have separate modules that are forced to compete with each other, then these teams that are working on just sequencing or just data availability can focus on that one part, and they can produce the best part for all developers to consume.
That all makes sense. Thanks for the explanations there. One thing that I think people get confused about, which Nick alluded to as well, is what exactly is data availability, right? I think consensus and execution are relatively well understood. Data availability seems to be not so well understood, right? Like you'll often hear Tolly or Solana or integrated proponents will say DA is the ultimate bottleneck, right? The bandwidth is the ultimate bottleneck. Can you guys explain from first principles like what exactly data availability is, how data availability sampling comes into that, and just for people who are completely unfamiliar with the concept?
So data availability, a lot of people think like, oh, well, Arweave or Filecoin are data availability solutions because it sounds like the same thing as data storage, but they're very, very different things. Data availability is the point of it is that it protects from a specific kind of attack that validators of a blockchain can execute, which is called a data withholding attack, which is that they can basically say, hey, I produced this new block and this is the new state of the chain, but I'm actually not going to tell you what transactions took place. And so you're just going to have to like believe me, basically. In a normal monolithic blockchain, the way that you solve data availability is that every full node downloads all the data in the chain. And that works because now you know, like, okay, the data has been published, it's there. I'm not just trusting the validators that they produce this block. But the problem with that is that it doesn't scale because now if you want to increase the size of the block, every node in the network has to download that much more data. And so they need that much more bandwidth. And so the resource requirements in that scheme just don't scale well. So you'll end up maxing out on like the total number of transactions, like the data throughput of the chain very quickly. And the approach that was like a revolution is this thing called data availability sampling, where you can actually verify that all the data behind a block was published without having to download all of it. So instead, you erase your code the block. It's actually like Solana does some similar things in the way that they do shredding of the block, but that's more for gossiping, at least the way that it's currently designed. And you take a bunch of different samples of that erasure coded data, and then you get this very, very high probabilistic guarantee that all the data has been published. So all of a sudden now you can increase the size of the block without forcing people to increase the node requirements. And so like it's a really like powerful thing.
The first thing to note about data withholding attacks is that it's really hard to prove. So if someone's asking me to give them a block and I don't give it, they can't show like, hey, I asked Neel and he didn't send it. They could be lying or I could be lying. So either person could be dishonest. And that's what makes it so tricky. So like, why would someone want to do a data withholding attack? And Nick mentioned optimistic rollups. So just to put it a little more concretely, in one blockchain construction, you might have, this would be a really efficient construction where you have one node that receives transactions, it produces the state root, or it produces the result of executing all of those, and it writes that result somewhere. And they say, okay, if anyone can prove that that's invalid in the next week, then we'll wipe it. Otherwise, that state root's going to be finalized in 1 week. And the critical assumption there is, how do you prove that something was invalid? And it's exactly what Nick was saying, which is you actually need access to those transactions to say, see, like Neel ran this transaction and the result is not what he said. So that's the key idea behind data withholding attacks, and that's why data availability is necessary.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. You may have hit on this a little bit, but I think it's really important to frame it as like light clients as well in this conversation, because like you said, in a regular blockchain, the full validators are going to download all of the blocks and all of the transactions. So this data availability is not really a factor. It's just when you want to have end users be able to verify that those transactions have been made available. And I think it's probably also good to know, this took me a while to figure out, that just because the data has been made available, it doesn't mean it's going to always be there or retrievable. Like those are two different things, right? Like you want to make sure that's been published, and that's what something like Celestia does. But then some people are like, well, why don't you just do it with Filecoin? Filecoin is where data can be stored there and you know it's going to be there later. But the whole point is, without Celestia or a data availability solution, you don't know that it's been published at all. So you never know that's actually even made it to something like Filecoin. So maybe if you, Nick, just describe like light clients really quickly and the minority trust assumption.
Absolutely. I just want to quickly give an analogy. I think analogies are really, really useful in explaining all this stuff because it's very easy to get lost in all the terminology and just it's nuanced and very confusing. But like one way to understand data storage versus data availability is that data storage is like canning food and like packing it away on shelves or like putting it in a freezer. And it's like, okay, well, I know it's there and I can get it later. I'm not going to eat it right now. Data availability is like a buffet. It's like, hey, all the food is out here and it's fresh, and like you can go and sample and take anything and you know, verify that like this dish is there, available to be eaten by everyone that's here. But they're not going to then like, you know, store that food necessarily. Like that food can get stored by a different function. And like data availability is important for the safety of the chain, like the security of the validity of the state transitions, whereas storage is sort of different. It is relevant more to liveness. But anyway, to your question about like light clients, right? This goes back to the root of what blockchains are about, right? And what blockchains are is a tool for scaling trust among people, right? And you know, there's different ways of scaling trust. We have like written law, and we have, you know, police force and things that we like these rules that we agree to so that we can all like cooperate. And what makes a blockchain unique is that like you don't actually have to have a court system or a government or something, or like a trusted third party in the middle intermediating your sort of like cooperation with other people. And the way that blockchains do that is they make it so that everyone that's participating in a blockchain network knows what the rules of the blockchain are, and they actually enforce it directly themselves. So it's like a peer-to-peer like cooperation technology where people directly, like the users directly enforce the rules. And they do that by running a node. So a node basically has a copy of the blockchain's rules. You know, like in Bitcoin, it's like, hey, we can't spend coins you don't own. And, you know, you can't have more than 21 million Bitcoin. And if anyone tries to break those rules, everyone's going to see it. Everyone that's running a full node will see it and reject it. So that's like kind of how rules get enforced. Now, and the whole concept, the whole goal, right, is to remove these intermediaries and this like these trusted third parties. Now, there's kind of been a trend where people have kind of like lost sight of that as sort of like the North Star, or the core value prop of blockchains. And we've kind of moved towards this world where users actually kind of like delegate trust to validators or people who run RPC services. Like users were always meant to run full nodes and verify the blockchain themselves. And now we've kind of like shifted away from that because it's kind of impractical, because like monolithic blockchains, the way that we've been building blockchains just inherently doesn't scale. And like it's too technically complex for an average user to do. Like very few people, only the most hardcore people run an Ethereum full node, for example. And I'm sure it's the same with Solana full nodes, right? And the issue with that is then you're reintroducing trust back into the system that's supposed to be sort of like a peer-to-peer, like trust minimized thing, because now you're trusting the validators to do the right thing, or you're trusting the full node person, the person who's verifying the chain on behalf of you, not to lie to you. So core to the Celestia's vision and the vision of the modular movement is this idea that users should be first-class citizens of the network, and users should be able to verify the network directly themselves. And the way they do that is not, instead of running a full node, because no matter what, there's no, like if you have to download every transaction and verify every transaction yourself, like that's just never going to scale. So instead, there's a new node type. So then there's light clients, by the way. And light clients assume that validators are being honest. They just verify the signatures and they're like, oh, okay, you know, this is safe. I trust that the validators aren't lying to me. But that's not trust minimized. So now what modular blockchains do is they introduce a new node type called a light node. And that's why I've been like tweeting and trying to meme light nodes so hard, and is because the light node gives you almost the same security guarantees as a full node, but it has the same, almost the same resource requirements of a light client. So it's like this amazing sort of like optimization, and it reaches a entirely new point on the trade-off curve between sort of like social scalability, like how much can people verify, and technical scalability, which is how much work, like how expensive is it to run this type of node. And so the vision is basically that everyone in the world, you know, using their phone can actually verify the chain directly. And that's going to make the chain so much more decentralized. And like a last point, I know this has been a long rant, is that in a data availability sampling network, running a light node is not just, you know, covering and protecting yourself. It actually contributes to the scalability and security of the overall protocol, because in a data availability sampling network, the more nodes that are sampling the data, the more the bigger the block size can be safely. And so like users aren't just like these passive recipients in a modular network. They actually become like active participants, verifying and contributing to the scale and security of the network. So it's like a really powerful shift into like a new way to think about what blockchains can be. And I think it's like really important that we make this shift if we're going to deliver the full value and potential of this technology.
Yeah, it's kind of like if we lived in a country where the government makes a bunch of decisions, but people, ordinary citizens, have no visibility into the political processes that are happening or the laws that are being passed. That's the current state of blockchains. Whereas with light nodes, now the citizens can directly verify and see, oh, this was the voting process that went into this decision. This is why this law exists. And they can directly see what's going on. So it introduces this concept of verifiability. I do think that the word light node is a little bit confusing because light client and light node sound really similar. And also in Ethereum land, it's like when you run a client, then you get a node. Whereas that's not the same relationship with light clients and light nodes. But maybe we can think about the naming a little bit.
Yeah, so a few interesting points there. I think the shift towards light nodes in the modular framework is an interesting one that, obviously makes a lot of sense. I'll also say that even integrated chains like Solana are trying to come up with their own versions of this. There's new client types being worked on. And so I think it is, it's definitely a worthwhile goal. One thing I'll push back on, and I'll put on my Tolly hat. So we've talked about how, maybe the point of blockchains in Nick's point of view is users should be able to run these nodes and validate everything and whatnot. I guess maybe where I'll push back is I'm not too sure if it matters if the incentives are not enough, right? So like what Tolly would probably say is, okay, you can run a node, but why would I want to run a node? What's my incentive here? And maybe you can kind of see this with things like Solana full node count versus Ethereum full node count. Ethereum is much more light on the node requirement aspect, right? You can run a node on, pretty much any laptop, I would say. Whereas Solana, you're not going to be able to do that, right? Depending on if you're running an RPC, you might require maybe even a terabyte of RAM. Yet, it seems that Solana has about 3,000-ish nodes versus Ethereum's, Ethereum has about 2 to 3 times more. But the trade-off is that Solana is about 200x cheaper on average in terms of fees. And obviously, Scale does more TPS, which kind of is a misleading metric because it's capacity on Ethereum, but it's demand on Solana right now. So I guess all that being said, like, would you agree or disagree with like how much do the incentives matter for running these nodes for the users?
The way that I see it, like a light node shouldn't be incentivized. And the reason why is because the user as they exist right now is already paying an exogenous cost. And that is so a cost that is not explicitly modeled within the system. And the cost that they're paying is a risk of not verifying. So instead, they're trading that cost that they're already paying in exchange for the explicit cost of running a light node. So to me, the user should probably run the light node. And I think that most people, if they were choosing between running a really lightweight light node in their browser and making sure that everything is functioning properly on the blockchain they're using versus not running that and instead saving like a penny per megawatt hour, so they're going to save like nothing. I think they'd probably choose to run it, assuming the light node is light enough.
Basically, my point here is that it seems that Ethereum nodes are obviously much lighter to run for any regular user.
The full nodes. Yeah, full nodes I think should be big, in my opinion, as long as everyone's running a light node.
So Neel, at Eclipse, you've taken essentially the SVM. I know you've gone beyond that and made it where you can basically spin up a rollup pretty easily. Can you say what Eclipse is and how it plays into this whole modular framework?
Yeah, right now Eclipse, I'd say our primary flagship product is an SVM rollup, and we're actually going to be launching one on Ethereum pretty soon. And historically, that was difficult because the way that we were doing or approaching settlement required doing some stuff that wasn't really possible on the ETH-L1. But now the approach is that we're doing that part of the compute in a zero knowledge way, and then we'll settle that zero knowledge proof directly on Ethereum. And that's what we're going to be launching over the next few months. So we're pretty excited about that. And actually, we have Mert at Helios running some of the nodes for Eclipse.
Nice. Get Mert in there. Yeah, I think it's really exciting because people obviously the SVM is one of the like most optimized parallelizable virtual machines, and now you're making it where you can do that in rollups. So right now, and you'll hear this from Samani, it's not that he's maybe negative against L2s, it's the EVM itself, just lacking, you know, parallel transactions, etc. So I think it's really exciting you're doing that. Now Eclipse is a settlement layer as well. How I think about settlement might be different than you. So I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on this. So a lot of people talk about L2s as extending Ethereum. It's like, this is how we scale Ethereum, is we have L2s. To me, that's not really true. L2s, what they do is with settlement, right? You have this bridge on the L1 that's trust minimized with the L2. And what it does right now, for the most part, is people just have L1 assets. They put it on the bridge, they take it to the L2, and they play around. There's a whole lot more assets on the L1 than the L2. The L1, I think rollups really only scale Ethereum in the sense that they scale ETH. They don't scale Ethereum. So you get trust minimized access to liquidity, which is ETH, which is right now what most people want to use other than USDC. So I'm curious with Eclipse, what's the reasoning for having this settlement layer that doesn't really have a base asset potentially that people are going to get access to? Because I see that as the main benefit of using Ethereum as a settlement layer.
Yeah. So to me, there's a few reasons why you need to settle. One is that for bridges, you need to have some canonical root that everyone agrees on. So that's the main reason why you would need to settle somewhere. Our reason for having a separate settlement layer was just because it just seemed very cumbersome to settle on Ethereum, but we'll actually likely be getting rid of our settlement layer, just for context. So that's a little bit of alpha. Not that anyone was like heavily using the settlement layer to begin with, but yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, I agree that you get to scale Ethereum liquidity in some sense. But I think, to me, what a Rollup's doing is it's scaling some of the security properties of Ethereum. So, and depending on what the modular architecture is that you're using, you might be scaling some of those properties and not others. So you might be scaling just the reorg resistance, but not the liveness or something like that. And that just depends on the construction. But curious to get Nick's thoughts on that as well.
Well, so settlement is an overloaded term because it can be used to mean a lot of different things, and it can, or sometimes it's not always like universally necessary when building a rollup to have like a settlement layer, right? So there's certain constructions like interactive verification games where it's helpful to have like in a blockchain to sort of like actually conduct this sort of fraud proof game. But there's a lot of chains, like if it's a ZK rollup, for example, like they don't need to post their proofs anywhere. They can actually just send their proofs over the peer-to-peer network to all the light nodes or full nodes, and people can verify it directly. So it doesn't actually have to be posted on Ethereum to be verified for people to know what's real. But then settlement also has another sort of association with it, which is bridging, right? And so like, why would you settle to Ethereum? It's because basically what you're doing is you're having a bridge to Ethereum, so that like people can put assets into your rollup and also have some level of security that they can withdraw those assets when they want to, and their assets are safe. So settlement is kind of like a very I don't know, overloaded term. And I think what's really exciting in the modular like blockchain movement is this idea of sovereign rollups, where the idea is that if you have to settle to another blockchain, you kind of give up some degree of control to that other chain. By enshrining that bridge in your protocol. And in a sovereign rollup case, you actually make the choice to sort of retain sovereignty within your community and not enshrine a bridge contract into like the way that your canonical chain is determined. And that gives you, it's more like a Cosmos app chain where like you have control and you can fork and upgrade and do what you want. Obviously, this whole can of worms. There's a whole like debate around this. And there's a lot of different ways to slice it, but that's my take on settlement. And Celestia made a very conscious decision not to enshrine a settlement layer into the L1 because doing so would add execution and state into Celestia. And our goal is to be as minimal as possible, have like no execution, as minimal state as possible, so that we can be as light and modular and flexible as possible. And so, and like a lot of people, that was their complaint, is like, oh well. Unlike Ethereum, Celestia doesn't have settlement built in. And the upside is that people can then settle wherever. So we have people now building their own settlement layers. We will be, Osmosis just announced that they will be running Celestia Light clients, and people might, because of that, will be able to settle their rollups to Osmosis. People can also settle to Ethereum. We have a quantum gravity bridge. So it's like, I don't know, that's the nice thing about modularity is it's so pluralistic and people can build whatever they want, even in regards to settlement.
One reason why I like the fact that settlement is overloaded for both light clients and verifying the state of the chain and bridges is because they're inherently doing the same thing. So it's kind of nice to point that out and say, actually, what a bridge is really doing is the same exact work that a light client is doing. So a sovereign rollup really isn't so different than a smart contract rollup, other than you've written that light client as a smart contract. It's receiving the same information and verifying the same information. And then on that sovereign rollups versus smart contract rollup point, my only concern is just that when you have a bridge that has a ton of assets in it, then that ultimately does have some say in your sovereignty as a rollup. Like you don't want to fork away and make all those bridge assets useless or something. So that's the one last consideration.
Hey everyone, quick break to tell you about Jito. Jito is the #1 liquid staking provider in Solana. Jito's been known for their MEV software, and now they're the fastest growing liquid staking provider in the Solana ecosystem. Solana DeFi summer is heating up, and what asset do you want to use in DeFi? Liquid staking tokens. Why? Because with Jito, you can take your SOL, stake it, and get instant access to liquidity through their liquid staking token, Jito SOL. You can then use Jito SOL throughout the Solana DeFi ecosystem while earning yields through MEV rewards and staking rewards with Jito. And Jito makes staking super simple. You can take your SOL, stake it, get instant liquidity, and start earning rewards all within 3 clicks. And not only do they make it simple, they make it secure. Jito has 7 audits, they have more than 1 million SOL staked, and they're one of the most respected teams in all of DeFi. Jito is for whales who need deep liquidity. It's also for people like me and you who just want to get started with liquid staking. You have your SOL, why not stake it, earn some yield, and start dabbling in Solana DeFi. So go get started today. Check them out at jito.network/staking. That's jito.network/staking. I'll put a link in the show notes. Use the link so they know that I sent you, and go get started today. Everyone, we'll get back to the show in a minute, but I want to let you know that we got our Permissionless conference coming up. This is our conference with Bankless. That's the biggest and best conference in DeFi. It's going to be in Austin, Texas this year. Yep, I know you love it. They got tacos, barbecue, Barton Springs. Got it all. September 11th through the 13th. If you've been in crypto for a while, you know that the bear market conferences are the best conferences because those are the ones where all the alphas had. The people that are still in crypto all really want to be there. It's going to be great for building a network, for learning a lot. And look, we've got a phenomenal lineup of speakers that include people like Hasu, Stani, Christine Moy, and Kyle Samani. Talking about ZK Tech, Rollups, account abstraction, MEV, Appchains, and more. Look, I'm damn excited. Because you're a listener of Lightspeed, you're going to get a special discount. Type in discount code Lightspeed30 and you'll get 30% off your ticket. That's right. Just type in Lightspeed30 when buying a permissionless ticket and get 30% off. Click the link at the bottom of this episode and go get it now because prices are going up every 2 weeks. All right, back to the show. I've got one more question I was going to bring in later, but on Celestia's decision to be credibly neutral when it comes to not having an Enshrine settlement layer like Ethereum has. And you do that one reason to be credibly neutral. It's also like state management, etc. How do you think about that decision, though? Because I've seen a proposal, for example, to support ZK snark verification on Celestia so that you can have this two-way trust minimized bridge. But to do that, you have to like support certain ZK schemes, which means you're kind of picking a favorite, whether that's like Starkware or ZK Sync or someone else. So you start getting to these decisions where it's like, well, maybe for the adoption of Celestia, it's best for us to actually start. It's almost like Cosmos Hub, for example, did the credibly neutral. We're not going to really support one, chain versus the other. We're not going to have a DEX on the hub, but then they launched a DEX and then they took it back. And now it seems, again, they're actually being less credibly neutral by picking like 10 chains that they're going to support. And they're almost like crowning a DEX, for example, doing that. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on staying credibly neutral? Like, do you think that was the right path? And how do you see that going forward?
1000% the right path. I think, blockchains are, especially like a base layer, the main thing, I think one of the most important things, aside from all the actual like technical features and everything, is this deep commitment and alignment to be incredibly neutral. Because if I were building a rollup, right, and I was thinking about, okay, which stack am I going to build on? If I felt there was any kind of favoritism or unfair competition or whatever, it's like I would be like, okay, well, screw that. Like I'm going to build somewhere else where I know it's going to be fair and open. And so Celestia is deeply, deeply committed to this idea of credible neutrality. In regard to the ZK opcode thing, I think what's important to clarify is that the reason that we want to have some form of very, very minimal settlement is so that we can actually bridge the Celestia token up in a trust minimized way to rollups. We don't want to be used as like a settlement layer, like, oh, people should start posting all their proofs there just to like get final security. It's more about that feature of like, we want to be able to take the token and bridge it up in a trust minimized way. And so we're going to keep that very minimal and be very clear that that's our goal. And we're not trying to compete in like the settlement domain necessarily. And you're right that like choosing whichever like proof system we choose to support could like sort of crown a winner or whatever. But also there's another way of looking at it, which is that a lot of these proofs can be proven within each other. So like, let's say you're using a different kind of proving system, you could wrap it in that other proof and then post it to Celestia. But I think it's going to be a huge upgrade. And like kind of the idea somewhat stems from Bitcoin actually, where people have been talking about like adding an opcode into Bitcoin to do the same thing. And you could have ZK rollups on Bitcoin.
So one thing I want to touch up on is, while we're on the topic of maybe credible neutrality, L2s on Ethereum have been sort of interesting lately. And what I mean by that is you have the launch of Base and, the bald coin or token. But then Base itself, doesn't necessarily have, it's like stage 0 from L2beat.com, right? And then you have like actually much more further along rollups like Arbitrum. And then you have Optimisms of the world, ZK Sync, Starknets. And then Polygon, of course. You have all these kind of different options. Some of them are further along than others. What is your mental framework for looking at these rollups and the state of the Ethereum L2 kind of roadmap? Do you think it's executing well? Do you think they've gotten it right so far? Like, what are your general thoughts? Neel and then Nick.
Yeah, my personal view is that OP Stack pushed adoption a little bit too fast, too early. Just because I don't think that the state of their tech is in a position to be trying to convince people to use it at the scale that they're pushing it. And then the other thing that I think is a little bit misleading is just that a lot of the apps that I think they're pushing people to use on OP Stack don't actually economically make sense to run on OP Stack, at least as it exists right now. So, but I also recognize that OP Labs has been working toward fault proofs, and I think that they've been doing some really good work in that direction. But I think it's also important to recognize like the great work that Arbitrum has done. They recently enabled fault proofs, or Fuel Labs, who has had fault proofs for God knows how long. So I don't want to discount that.
Yeah, my perspective on it is that, look, one thing about modular blockchains is that they are technically extremely ambitious, because data availability sampling super hard to build in practice and scale. Rollups and like fraud and ZK proofs are really, really hard to build. And so, and there's just so much work that still has to be done. And so, rollup tech is still very early. That the whole modular stack is very early. And I think we have to be careful of not obfuscating the risks and being very upfront and transparent about the actual security of the system. So I think that's what's really important. I think that's part of what people are kind of like, getting up in arms about, is like feeling like, hey, you're not being intellectually honest about your tech. And I think that's actually a very healthy thing. And we need to keep each other honest because like, otherwise, we have a responsibility, because the users like are in some ways trusting us to do our homework and to like secure these systems in the way that we say. And overall, I think one of the surprising things is that I think that the speed at which ZK rollups have come onto the scene, like Polygon ZK EVM, what Starkware has done, and even ZK Sync, are all like super impressive and like way ahead of schedule, in my opinion. And I would like the kind of the selling point of optimistic rollups was like, oh, well, fraud proofs are going to be so much easier to build. And, Arbitrum obviously has really great tech. The stuff that Optimism is doing around Bedrock, like, and making like the proof system super modular, so they can even actually adopt ZK proofs, is really inspiring. And so like, it's not zero sum. And I think people should just like give it time and just be intellectually honest. And we'll be fine in the long run.
It's a really good answer. Nick, I've listened to a number of your podcasts. You're way too nice all the time, but also insightful. So you're honest the whole time. So I appreciate it. I think a good analogy for me, which you see probably on Twitter, is how crypto is like building software, but with like hardware responsibilities. I've worked at like 2 different tech startups, and if people using our products saw what was going on every day, there's no way that they should or would pick to use it. But with crypto, it's kind of the same thing. It's just there's actual like money on the line in smart contracts, so it feels different. I do want to touch on Kyle Samani's piece on just a few of the critiques of modular blockchains and maybe things that are looked over. But before I get to that, I just want to give you like the opportunity of maybe say like, why would a developer go with the modular approach? It's obviously very difficult to build. I've heard about Celestia for a long time now, and I've like been really pumped up about it, but I don't think we're on mainnet yet. So it's almost like all this work up front, but there's a reason you're doing it. So from a developer's perspective, like why is it exciting that you could, have access to these modular parts?
Well, first I want to start by acknowledging the merits of Kyle's piece, because I think maybe there were some uncharitable interpretations of it. I like that. So it looks like he did his homework, and I think that's really cool. And modular blockchains don't really make things faster. That's true. They don't necessarily make things cheaper. And these are some of the points that he raised in his post. I think the parts that he misses is he talks about what's theoretically possible on an L1 if a developer works around the constraints of it. But to me, it really comes back down to ownership. And it's like when you own the blockchain yourself, you don't need to jump through hoops, or you don't need to work with the core developers. You can just push a change to your execution layer. And it's because it's yours, you're the one who now gets that functionality, and you don't have to worry about convincing other stakeholders other than your community. Or another example, he talks a lot about MEV as being a new monetization opportunity and how that's not really true. One is that some of the approaches he mentioned seemed a little bit cumbersome to implement in practice. But 2, it seems to miss a really obvious point, which is that, and I think Kyle himself would have to admit that L1s have some business model outside of MEV. Whatever that business model is, if you're an app and you have your own app chain, now you also get that business model. So unless it's really true that like apps can capture all the value from the L1 or L2, at which point like any L1 or L2 investment would be very bearish. And I don't think it's true. A great example of that is if you just look at Base, for example. They launched officially just earlier this month. They've already earned millions in revenue. Base, if they deployed to Ethereum or to Polygon, they would not have accrued that value. They wouldn't have been able to capture that. And the reason why they did is because they're a big enough organization that they were able to draw developers around them. And it's like the ability for an app to actually turn itself into more than just an app, but also an infrastructure and an ecosystem where they can accrue the value that they're actually driving. So that's the way that I would probably reframe the piece. And I think that there's someone on my team who's actually writing something up more thoughtful. But yeah, that's the synopsis.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that I felt like Neel said, Kyle definitely did his homework. And when I read through the piece, I was like, these are solid points and solid arguments. I felt, I wrote a thread kind of as a response, and some of the things that I want to push back on is first, he claims that modular makes it way more complex for developers, and that's just not true. And in fact, the long term, one of the things that we believed in Celestia since the very beginning is we want to make it as easy to deploy your own blockchain or your own rollup as it is to deploy a smart contract. And at first, that really seemed like a pie in the sky vision, frankly, because everything was so raw. But we're actually really close, approaching that very, very quickly. And you can even go online and try Conduit or Caldera or Vistara. That there's all these roll up as a service companies where it literally is one click and a minute, and you have your own roll up. And so the point is, in the modular stack, it doesn't inherently increase complexity, but it gives developers sort of the ability to go into more layers of the stack and customize, and that becomes more complex. So you can actually write your own, virtual machine, or you can, customize the EVM with specific precompiles or whatever. So you have the ability to customize if that's what you want to do. But if you don't want to, you can literally just deploy, an EVM rollup or SVM rollup out of the box, and it's really not much harder than deploying a smart contract. And so, it really doesn't increase complexity unless you want complexity. It gives you the choice, and that's why we always say at Celestia, build whatever, because we really, one of our core beliefs is developers will be able to build better apps if they have more freedom. more freedom to choose from different components, more freedom to go and customize. And so I think that's like a really major one. And he also tried to claim that like MEV is something that apps like smart contracts, like you don't need to build your own app chain or to capture MEV. I'm not saying that it's not possible to do that. I think there's ways of clever ways of building a smart contract so that it can capture MEV. But like inherently, the way like MEV arises from like validators or sequencers, right? Which are kind of like outside of the protocol. And so you like the deeper into the stack you can go to customize things, the more you're going to be able to actually design the system to capture MEV. So like a really great example of this is what Skip is doing in the Cosmos ecosystem, where they've developed this thing called protocol on building, which is more for like app chains, but can be modeled very well to actually application specific rollups. And what that is basically that there's like validity rules within the chain state transition itself that enforce what kind of MEV can be captured and then how the MEV profits are distributed. Or even there's things like, okay, well, we're going to choose an entirely new execution model where like the transactions, let's say I'm a DEX, instead of having all the transactions be processed like in serial, they're batched together and it's all done at once. But like you need to go deeper to customize to get there. So like, and MEV being one of the biggest like value capture sort of like avenues for applications, at least as of now, I think that's really, really important to like give builders and communities access to that.
Yeah, though Kyle's response would be like, give me a specific application, an MEV example, and I will give you a specific smart contract construction that captures that. So like in the case of like one of the auction situations you mentioned, like you could impose like a sealed bid auction, and then you do like a Dutch auction off of that, and then you return the value back to the application. Technically, you could still capture it if you internalize. Like, of course, it has like longer block times if you do it that way, but like theoretically, you can still capture it. I just think that it's very cumbersome too, and I just also think it misses the fact that there's more monetization opportunities than just MEV. Like it's just like too narrow of a view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's well put. One thing that I'll say is like I think he's also like specifically referring to app developers as well, just people who want to like deploy maybe a consumer or payments app on top of the blockchain, as opposed to maybe like a pure blockchain developer. But it actually brings up a point that I want to touch on, which is kind of towards the end of the piece. He talks about the fact that this stuff like this is possible, but he hasn't seen many examples of it so far. And then he references the Cosmos ecosystem. What are your guys' thoughts on kind of the Cosmos ecosystem modularity versus kind of L2s and Rollups as a service? And like, how should people who are not familiar with this think about it?
So I guess my view on it is that for an L1, you need to have a bunch of validators. Those validators must all run full nodes. So you're burning some amount of money every month. And this can often be like millions of dollars per year. Whereas for a rollup, you just don't have that same fixed cost. But the trade-off you're making is that when you had your own L1, then there is no marginal cost. You're not paying rent for each of those transactions that's processed on your app chain. Whereas when you're a rollup and someone runs a transaction, you do have to write that to a layer one, whether that's to Celestia or whether that's to Ethereum or somewhere else. So that's a marginal cost that you have to pay, but you have way lower fixed costs. So what this means is that apps that were previously uneconomical to run as their own app chain can now run as their own app rollup. So to me, that's the fundamental difference.
Yeah, Neel hit the nail on the head. Well, first of all, I just want to say that Cosmos has been extremely influential in the entire sort of like modular vision of Celestia and beyond. And we use the Cosmos SDK, we use Tendermint, or now it's Comet, to build our chain. And Cosmos was the first people who realized actually you can decouple consensus from execution, but they did that at the software level, right? So they kind of modularized the software stack for building a blockchain, and that made it really easy to customize the state machine of your chain and build an app chain, for example. And then Celestia kind of took that a step further and said that, hey, actually, we can modularize not just at the software level, but at the protocol level itself. So now, instead of having to, like, you take Tendermint or Comet and like get a bunch of validators and launch your chain, it's like actually Celestia can act as your shared Tendermint network. And like what Neel said, so there's a couple of big advantages. The first one is like you just get to share by sharing resources, you can dramatically save on costs. Like running an app chain is extremely expensive for a lot of different reasons, just like the actual infrastructure, the social costs of actually coordinating everything and maintaining everything. And all of a sudden you can just remove all that and just pay transaction fees to run your chain. And so that's a massive leg up on the economics. And also it removes the need for you to issue your own token when you want to launch a new blockchain. And so I think that's really huge. And then another part of it is that when you share a common consensus and DA protocol under the hood, your app chains get a superpower, which is they can interoperate in a more secure way, because they can actually verify each other's data availability, and they can actually reason about the ordering of the other chain's blocks. And so you get this fundamentally new level of security when it comes to interoperabilities. They're almost more even though they're separate chains, they're almost more they're kind of between smart contracts on a shared blockchain like Ethereum or Solana, and fully separate chains. They're kind of they're separate, but then they're sharing this underlying security that they can actually talk to each other, not atomically, but they can interoperate super securely.
Why would you build on Eclipse versus the Solana, L1? And that might be because you have something that'll motivate a specific use case. So curious your thoughts.
As far as why deploy to Eclipse, or in particular our SVM L2 on Ethereum, I think that the number one reason is to access Ethereum users who in general are less price sensitive. So if you want the absolute cheapest transactions, then you'd probably want to be on the Solana L1. But you get this free bridge, and Ethereum users, I think, are really going to like the idea once we launch our mainnet of just immediately benefiting from this highly parallelized virtual machine, which is the same as Solana. And we get to borrow a lot of those great innovations that Toli and the team have made. But then they also get to be within the ecosystem that they're comfortable with. They can use ETH to pay for gas. They get a lot of the stuff that Ethereum users are used to. So, and then we have some collaboration with a major Solana wallet where we're building a MetaMask snap. So this is a MetaMask. It's kind of an extension to MetaMask where you can use your MetaMask wallet on the Eclipse chain or on SVM chains. So that's going to be a really big unlock for the Ethereum community.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. I'm super bullish on the SVM and Eclipse. Not financial advice. One thing that I'm curious about, which is kind of unrelated in a sense, but I thought it was an interesting take on Twitter. Fubar recently tweeted that decentralizing sequencers isn't really the point of L2s, and maybe it's not even worth the effort. What really matters is getting rid of multi-sig control and proofs.
Yeah, there's some cases where, so what are you really giving up when you have a centralized sequencer? You don't give up safety or liveness in the formal sense. Of course, you give up liveness guarantees in a short term, because usually the way that you regain liveness theoretically is through some sort of forced inclusion through the L1, which probably has longer block times and blah, blah, blah. So you don't really give up anything from a security perspective is my point. But what you do give up is that single sequencer has a freedom to reorder things as they see fit. And they can continue doing that indefinitely. So that's the way that I see it. And for some DeFi applications, I think that'll prove to be really difficult because you don't want the sequencer to be trusted in doing that. And it'll end up being a really profitable avenue, assuming that one sequencer has a lot of really high value order flow. But I think that it's true that for a lot of apps, like games, for example, they probably just want the lowest latency or the shortest confirmation time, at which point a centralized sequencer makes a lot of sense. So, but I wanted to hear Nick's take too.
I think Neel did a good job of explaining it. The way that a rollup, basically what Fubar is saying is that rollups are supposed to be trust minimized and ensure the state validity or that the rules of the rollup are followed. And until you have fraud proofs and ZK proofs and all that stuff, they're fundamentally not secure. That rollup operator could actually just steal all your money. Right. And I do think that is actually far more important than what decentralizing the sequencer gets you, in the sense of what decentralizing the sequencer does is it makes it so that you have better censorship resistance and liveness, depending on the construction of how the rollup is sequenced. And because that sequencer could just decide hey, I don't like you, I'm not accepting your transactions. All of a sudden you're kind of screwed. Or they could just decide, hey, I'm just gonna, or they're wherever they're running their node, there's a power outage or something, and all of a sudden the whole chain just halts, right? So censorship resistance and liveness are really important like features of blockchains, but I don't put them in the same level of priority as like just straight up validity and verifiability of the underlying like execution. Now, for a long time, that was kind of an issue, an open issue. It's like, okay, well, one of the benefits of running a rollup is that you don't have to bootstrap a new consensus network or sequencer network, right? Because like that's a lot of overhead socially, and then you have to run all these nodes. It's kind of like, oh man, that's a lot of work. And if you have to do that for every single rollup, it's like we're not really getting the full benefit of these systems. And that was like a problem that was constantly bothering me for a really long time up through last year. And then Evan, one of the engineers on our team, had this idea for, and we had this concept of like, okay, how can we have a shared sequencer, right? So that you can actually deploy a rollup that has all these benefits without having to actually bootstrap the sequencer yourself. And he came up with this really cool construction of actually how to do it. And now there's a few teams, Astria and Espresso, building out, and also like Fairblock, there's a few like Radius, a bunch of teams building out these systems so that you can actually have a decentralized sequencer, but without having to add more overhead. Because that's also one of Fubar's points is like, well, why would you even decentralize a sequencer if it's going to just compromise on the value prop of a rollup, which is that like you only need one node basically, and like there's less overhead. And so like that's a cool thing about a shared sequencer is you get the best of both worlds, where like you get decentralization, censorship resistance, liveness guarantees, while not needing to run new infrastructure for yourself.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that I think there's a place for Solana, the L1, to play in the sequencing space. With Neon, now it could be the one to order EVM transactions across many rollups. And maybe multiple Neon deployments could represent multiple rollups that need their sequencing done. Then you just need something to relay those transactions to the L1 that the rollup ultimately ends up wanting to publish their data to. But there's some nuances there, like Neon uses a specific version of the EVM, which is likely not the same as many of the more recent rollups that were built. And we're still thinking through the details of what that would even look like. But I think that there's some place for Solana to play there. And we were just talking about it with Toli a few days ago. So that's one thing to note. One other thing to keep in mind is that I think that people get obsessed with the words centralized and decentralized, because that's a remnant from L1s, where that was a critical property in order for the system to operate in a trustless way. To whatever degree trustlessness actually makes sense as a concept, because you're always kind of trusting something. But for a rollup, you don't necessarily, it's possible for a system to exist where a component or multiple components are centralized, meaning there is one logical entity that represents them, yet the whole system is still fully verifiable and it's still permissionless to enter. And it's still, I hate using the word trustless, but it's still trustless to some degree.
I have actually two questions, so bear with me here. One is I just want both your takes on Neon EVM and kind of, EVM compatibility on Solana, which is an interesting concept that I don't think people have talked about that much. And two, this is kind of unrelated, but I've seen kind of in the modular world multiple futures proposed. There are some futures where people think maybe 1, 2, or maybe even 3 L2s will kind of just dominate everything, and all value will or execution will flow through them. And then there are some who say like there'll actually be many different and diverse kind of L2s and L3s and whatnot, and fractal scaling. Which approach resonates more with you? Which do you think is more likely to happen? Which do you prefer?
I could see the largest K apps, and I'm reluctant to say what K is, but maybe the largest 20 or 30 apps having their own chain. So I certainly don't see a world where it's just 2 or 3 L2s. And I also feel like there are few benefits of the world where there are only 2 or 3 L2s versus the one where we have a diversity of execution layers, all with different social norms and different types of precompiles. Because like I was mentioning before, to me, one of the chief benefits of modularity is ownership, meaning that you can pass governance proposals and you can modify that execution layer as you see fit. And that's just not possible if you're sharing the chain with many other people. So that's my view on the number of chains. It's hard for me to put a real number on it, though.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Mert. And frankly, like the jury is still very much out. And actually, this kind of also relates to Kyle's post in the sense of like, he thinks that composability is so important that literally every app should just live on the same thing. And actually, that's not incompatible with a modular world either. Like the modular world could end up being that there's literally just one massive execution layer that takes up all of Celestia's block space. So like if that's actually the way that things play out, then like it's that would also work in a modular framework. Where I see things going is that I think there's going to be a spectrum, and I think there's definitely going to be general purpose execution L2s, in the ecosystem. And what people might do, right? And this is another thing, is like, in order to build in the modular stack, you don't have to roll your own and like deploy your own blockchain. You can build on one of these general purpose L2s too. So people will probably start building apps there. Maybe apps that really need a lot of composability, like certain DeFi things. There'll be like some DeFi hub where all those things are there and they get atomic composability. But then if people like, they might try out their app as a smart contract on a shared execution L2, and then they like get some traction, they get some product market fit, and then they're like, hey, you know what? In order to take our product to the next level, in order to capture more value or whatever, we're going to actually have to deploy our own rollup. And then they kind of like make that transition and actually build themselves into their own chain. And I think I think the incentives to building your own chain, if you have a successful application, are going to be so massive that, like what Neel is saying, like I think that all the top apps, like breakout apps, are going to do that. And there even could be a world where if you become like the Google of decentralized applications, you might even go off of Celestia as a DA layer and actually just maybe build your own standalone chain, for example. Like maybe you need that level of customization and it's worth it. Like the trade-offs are worth it. I don't know. But I think like there are huge incentives for a successful app to roll their own chain. But like a lot of people might just experiment as a smart contract because like it will be easier. You'll be able to like tap into more like an existing community, etc.
That's such a good point raised by Nick. That's also my personal view, that apps should start as smart contracts and start by deploying to a shared chain. And if there's some reason why, whether it's because you want to capture more value or you're hitting the constraints or you're really trying to push the limits of what's possible on chain, then you build your own rollup. And like Nick mentioned, there's some amount of transaction volume where that fixed cost of an L1 now makes sense for you to incur because you've sufficiently amortized it. If you're running hundreds of millions of transactions per year on your chain, it probably does make sense for you to be an L1. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
I want to get into like network effects and value accrual. And Neel, you had a speech that I think the title was "Rollups as a Service are Going to Zero." So yeah, I'm just curious in this world where you have like ETH as this settlement layer, then you have like Solana, which is this global state machine, then you have Celestia, which is DA. You have shared sequencers. Like, where does value accrue in this world? Because I have this like smiling curve, which you can just think of a smile going up and down, that I more or less made up, but it's from Ben Thompson. On like the left, I'm saying there's definitely going to be, or at least in my mind, there's going to be demand for a global state L1. Like, there's just some use cases for that. Probably not number 2 through 100, but there will be a number 1. You're going to have something that's like a settlement layer, a store value, which would be like Ethereum or Bitcoin today. You're going to have these top apps, which would be like the 5% top of apps, which would be like Fang that you see in equities. And then at the bottom of the smiling curve, where it's like the lowest value, is where all the competition happens and like things are commoditized, which in my head was like the modular infrastructure and then just the majority of apps. So I'm curious, like across this whole spectrum, because now we have this giant supply chain. It was so easy. We went from Bitcoin to Ethereum, and now it's like this giant thing with all these tokens. Where does value accrue and like where are the network effects?
I was trying to make sense of the smiling curve, but I unfortunately didn't have enough time to think about it. But I was trying to think about what are the economic first principles that led to that smiling curve construction. And I can see why the top of the stack should have some pricing power or should be able to maintain some value accrual, because assuming that there's some stickiness there, then the bottom components should be able to be swapped out. That was my thinking. But I wasn't sure about the rest of it depends on the application too. Like I'd argue that Uniswap as an AMM on the ETH-L1 to some degree is kind of stuck there. Like they can't just fork and deploy to their own rollup and bring the community with them and necessarily get that same amount of volume. And I think that's a bit of a misconception. And the reason why is because the liquidity is on the ETH-L1 and they're the winner there. Whereas if you look at some of these other chains like Arbitrum, GMX is the winner. It's not Uniswap. Yet Uniswap is deployed there and Arbitrum wants them there. They've given them millions of dollars of incentives. So that's like one thing. It's like depends on the type of app. And I think it's something such as an order book or a perps exchange or something is much better suited to switch the pieces under the hood and just swap their UI. I think their users are going to be much more receptive to that than trying to convince your LPs who have already put their money into a specific blockchain to now move to some other chain which you control. I think that's less likely to get traction. So it depends on the app. It depends on the stickiness of the given part of the stack. And it also depends on how much that part of the stack is worth. So in that post, rollups of the service are going to zero. The reasoning that I went through was basically going through the functions of a blockchain that Nick was talking about: execution, consensus, DA, and then I also threw in settlement because it's popularly cited as a function of a blockchain. And I point out that at least for optimistic rollups, settlement gives very little money back to Ethereum. And to me, that's not really the advantage of Ethereum, or the advantage to Ethereum of being a settlement layer. The advantage to Ethereum is that now they've increased the moneyness of ETH, and everyone's using it as the lingua franca, and they're using it to pay fees, and therefore everyone's sitting on ETH. I think that's what a lot of people do, because there's no reason to convert to USDC and then to ETH every time you need to do something. It's just impractical because it's the denomination for so many items that we buy. So I guess that's the store value point that you were getting at, Garrett, when you put that on the far right side of the curve. And I don't know if that's really value capture so much as value, calling that value capture, I think I have to think about a little bit more. Like, what does it even mean to capture value? And to me, it means when a user pays a fee, how is that fee split across all parties? And ironically, Ethereum itself makes very little of that fee, assuming you're using Celestia for a DA and you're using a rollup on Ethereum, but the whole fee is paid in Ethereum, and therefore Ethereum still benefits. So yeah, we're interested to hear Nick's thoughts, but it's something that it might be something that we just need to see in practice, what users have the most sensitivity to and where they have the most demand elasticity.
Yeah, well, I was very surprised when Neel he tweeted and shared the thing that like Ethereum makes something like $5 a day or something in settlement fees or whatever. I was actually completely blown away. I was like, I mean, I knew I had a feeling it would be like pretty low because like, you know, you just post some data to Ethereum. That's all you do, especially if you're, this is for optimistic rollups, but like $5 a day, I was like, wow, that is like so minuscule.
Yeah, it's like the order of
30
to 64 bytes posted fairly infrequently because like it's 2 weeks challenge period anyway. What difference does it make if you're off by 1 hour? Sorry to cut you off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, you know, for the way that I see, I guess, value accrual and sort of the economics of all these chains to work out is that, you know, I actually, in some ways, block space is a commodity, but in a lot of ways it's not. And, you know, I think, you know, so like what block space is to me is like this, it's like a consumable good where, you know, it gets produced by a protocol and then people decide like, hey, we want to run our application on that block space, and they'll make that choice for a variety of different reasons. Some of it is just like the raw cost, you know, the security and decentralization of it, like how verifiable it is. There's like all these like dimensions of like why they're choosing to consume certain block space and not others. And the question you have to ask is like, well, are any of those dimensions of choosing to use this given block space, do they have any network effects around them? And I think when you go down that path, you realize that there are a few, but like, I think the most important one is that kind of what I was getting to earlier, which is that when by like using a shared DA layer and consensus network like Celestia, you're now kind of tapping into like a broader ecosystem. So there's actually like this, you become more closely aligned and like easier and more secure to interoperate with the whole universe of rollups that are built on top of that same shared DA layer. So you start having, like, as the ecosystem grows, you start having a larger incentive to deploy there. And also there's like network effects around the amount of scale versus cost to verify the block space. So the way that light nodes work sort of in a DA sampling network like Celestia is that the cost to verify the block scales as the square root of the block size. So as you get into bigger and bigger block sizes, your chain can support more and more throughput for less and less additional marginal cost on users to verify it. So then like once you kind of get to scale, if someone else is trying to build a new DA network, like those users that want to verify it actually end up having to pay more to verify it per unit of block space. And so I think you end up kind of getting these like economies of scale. And so I think for those two reasons, and there are a few more, like there will be strong network effects, and like block space is not commoditized. Like I'm not just going to have like, you know, some random dude like, hey, I made a DA chain, like why don't you use my block space? Like, you know, we also seen that not play out practically even in like the monolithic realm, where people like, you can make a copycat EVM chain, but people aren't going to want to use it for similar reasons. You have this trade-off, or like these two opposing views. One is like the fat protocol thesis, and the other is the sort of like fat app thesis. And the fat protocol thesis is like, well, the underlying L1 is going to be able to capture all the value, because that's like kind of they have like the ultimate power over all the MEV, or you know, whatever. Like they kind of are like the last buck. And then the fat app thesis is like, well, actually the applications are the ones that are going to be able to capture those value because they're closest to users. And I actually see the modular world as sort of like a synthesis of those two worlds, where like there will be value that accrues to you know, the infrastructure layer for providing like selling block space. But rather than trying to limit the scarcity of the block space to extract more value from users and applications, it's about actually providing extremely scalable and abundant block space so that people don't have to pay exorbitant amounts, but there's still like a healthy margin for selling that block space. And meanwhile, then the rest of the value capture can go to the applications. And I think long term, it's kind of like, you know, we have all these Web 2 apps who run AWS or Azure or whatever on the back end, and they're paying some of the profit of the entire stack goes into the infrastructure layer, but then a lot of it also gets captured by the apps themselves. And I think that's kind of like a good analogy for how to think about how it would play out at least in the modular stack. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I guess we've never seen an L2 switch DA layers. Maybe we have, maybe Nick would know better. But if you just look at the way that these L2s calculate the gas fee for the user, they have some oracle for the L1, and they take that gas fee or the price for block space, that estimate, as an input into their price calculation. So that tells you that the L2, at least in the short term, is not elastic in its demand. It pretty much pays what the L1 tells it to.
We'll close up here in a moment. I have one more question that I wanted to ask both of you. In one of Kyle Samani's papers, actually about 2 to 3 years ago, when he was first talking about Solana, he talks about like how if you're an enterprise, it's a big deal to pick the right tech stack, because if you pick the wrong one, it's very hard to switch, et cetera. And you need that consistency. And you also know that it's going to be able to scale in the future to support your business. When you think about institutions, both from your experience today and also just how you see it over the next 10 years, do you see them like Coinbase today is talking about payments on Ethereum, which is extremely expensive and rather slow, when they could be on Solana and using like Solana Pay? You have like one dependency layer. Whereas if you go this modular route, like, do they just spin up their own blockchain, their own data availability committee, where it's like, okay, we get to control everything ourselves? Or do they actually use like, we're going to use a shared sequencer, and then we're going to use Celestia for data availability, and you have all of these different dependencies? I'm just wondering from a practical perspective and what you're seeing today, where do you think these institutions, which we will need eventually, what do you think they'll use?
Some of the largest players that we've talked to, particularly game studios, I've had the same exact experience where they say, we're going to build our game on Ethereum. And in my head, I'm like, what are you doing? Like, that game's not even no one's going to use it because it's going to be so expensive. But they're very risk averse. And then another value add, and this is kind of a benefit of modularity for games, but it's that they don't have to pick a specific vendor if they're on their own rollup. Now they see themselves as de-risked, because even if the L1 implodes or something similar to what happened to me when I was building on Terra, if you're on your own rollup, then that's a little bit less of a risk for you, since theoretically your chain is still running and you can move elsewhere.
My view on this is, and I've been saying this for a while, and I felt kind of, I feel like this thesis has been increasingly validated, especially with like the launch of Base and some of the newer like OP stack launches, is that enterprise users are actually the perfect are the perfect like sort of customers for rollups and for modular blockchains, because they want the things that rollups provide. Specifically, they want more control and they want more customizability. And they have the resources and they have the user base, but they don't have to worry about being fragmented from an existing ecosystem. Like Base doesn't need Ethereum, doesn't actually really need to be part of Ethereum to like get users, or like, other like PayPal, let's say if they were to do their own rollup, like it's the same thing. Like they have a users existing, like they don't worry about that stuff. They can spend the money to do the development work to build their rollup. And in return, what they get is this like dedicated like instance that is customized for their app, providing a really good product experience. And they get more control too. Like they can, bake in KYC, or they can make it, free, or like have some kind of paymaster thing so that they pay fees on behalf of users, or there's all these different like customizations they can do. And so I think personally, I think that like, and another really important part, but although this is not a differentiator with like building a smart contract version of the app, but like, why wouldn't they build their own L1? Is that like, if they built their own like L1, like an app chain like Cosmos, they'd have to issue a token. Like they would have to run more of the infrastructure themselves. And then that's all kind of like this legal gray area. So it's kind of like, they'd rather just avoid that. And that's the beauty of doing a rollup, is like, you don't actually have to issue a token. You have to run an L1. It's much, I think, well, in some ways there's still like risks, obviously, but like, I think it's less risky. So to me, I think we're going to increasingly see more and more enterprises going the route of rollups.
All right. So we've done some solid thinking this episode. Thanks for your perspectives. Now we're going to get a little bit more lizard brain. I'm just going to ask brief questions, brief answers in rapid fire section. Obviously, feel free to expand. And then we'll just go Neel and then Nick in order every single time. Okay. How do you explain what you do to your parents?
I don't. My parents have never understood what I do. Even when I was at Citadel, they asked me, what are you doing? And they were so interested in electricity and commodities. They weren't really interested, but at a high level, they were just curious what I was spending all day doing. So I wrote a blog post called Explaining to My Parents What I Do. And I explained the power market. And I got so many positive responses to that post. It was top of Hacker News. People loved it. And then I found out months later, my mom didn't even read it. She read like the first sentence, and then she gave up.
Neel, you should send that to me and I'll put it in the show notes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll send it right now. Okay.
Nick?
Yeah, I on my end, I remember when I first actually read the Lazy Ledger white paper and was just like totally just consumed with passion. And I tried to explain it to my parents, and I must have to them been like the meme of the guy with the whiteboard, and like all the pins and like, because they were just like, okay, we can tell you're really into this, but it makes no sense. And so I kind of like fall back on this idea of like, I'm what we're building is a way for like to scale trust for humans using cryptography, and that'll kind of like form a new fabric and a new way for people to interact and sort of cooperate on a global scale. So that's kind of what I say, and that's also very vague, but it seems to at least make a little bit more sense.
What are your favorite 3 apps in all of crypto?
I think that Uniswap is king to me for its simplicity, because there were other AMM constructions before it, and I thought that that it's part of the reason for its adoption is because it's so easy to understand what's going on, and obviously they've gone beyond that, and it's inspired so many things. I think Helium's a great idea, and it essentially created an industry of decentralized physical infrastructure networks, which I personally am very bullish on. I recognize it's a bit of a bet, and if you look at the economics of it today, maybe it's not super sustainable, but that's the whole idea. And I think that people miss the concept of depends, which is you allow for wild speculation on the token, and you can use that speculation to make the network real, and it makes it a thing. And it's like a weird type of company where you release the stock on day one and let people buy it, and then they pay for your services in the form of the stock. It's just hard to make sense of, and people keep comping it to Web 2 stuff, and I think it's a completely broken way of assessing crypto protocols, and it's not the right way of modeling it. And then the last thing is probably, this is like a controversial one, but I think if the concept of Axie reached so many people and it did more for mainstream like crypto awareness, then probably the vast majority of like what a crypto maxi would call is like, oh, this is like a good app. It's doing good things for the world. I thought Axie overall actually did do good things for the world. And what they did was they raised awareness. They're trying something different, whether it's economically sustainable or not. They hit the limits of scalability and they were forced onto their own Rollup / sidechain. These are all very bullish indicators to me.
Yeah, I'd say, well, so my first two are a little Cosmos-centric and DeFi-centric, but I'm a big fan of Osmosis, just because I really love, they're sort of like, to me, validating the Appchain thesis in the sense of like, they have really kind of integrated all these pieces and are building the equivalent of like a SEX experience, centralized exchange experience on a decentralized exchange. And like there's like, you know, deposit and withdrawal, and I really like that as an idea. And I think someone needs to build something like that long term, where like, you know, people aren't using Binance, they're not using these centralized exchanges. Instead, like they're using a decentralized exchange, but that gives the same thing, because we can't have another FTX again, right? Like we need to learn and like evolve, and that's, if we can't do that as like a baseline, then we've kind of failed, in my opinion. The next one is Sommelier, because they're, I think, just, it's so clever what they've done. So they've built sort of like, it's sort of like a, you know, yield, sort of like a earn vault platform, but instead of building it natively on Ethereum, and most of the strategies aren't deployed on Ethereum, but it's like a dedicated chain, and by being its own app chain, it's able to execute strategies and have another layer of like security and sophistication that you couldn't do. So I really love that, and people should check that out. And the last one, I would say, I would have maybe said something like Axie, but I'll just like say DeFi Kingdoms, partly because you know, I used to be part of the Harmony team, and that was a really big breakout app for the Harmony chain. But DeFi Kingdoms, it's just really cool. Like gaming in general, I'm very like bullish on, like sort of the intersection of blockchains and gaming, and I think DeFi Kingdoms would like explore like a new dimension of that, that was like kind of like DeFi plus gaming dynamics, and I think there's something there. You know what I mean? Like in-game economies and DeFi. I don't know. Someone's going to crack that code at some point.
So you mentioned gaming is a sector you're bullish on, and Neel, you also mentioned Deepin. What is the vertical that you're most bullish on in crypto, and what is the vertical you're most bearish on in crypto?
Bearish on in the short term or long term? Because I think that in the short term, I'm just a little bit bearish on crypto gaming, just because the economics of it, or at least fully on chain gaming. Let me clarify. I think there's versions of crypto gaming that make a lot of sense, but fully on chain gaming, the value of the transactions is just too small. So I don't see that ever existing in any version of an actually decentralized blockchain. But that might be okay. If you want to use the blockchain as this read-only API and you want to interoperate with all the rest of crypto, and you get to have assets that can be, you know, ported out of the game and stuff like that. And to some degree that exists in Web 2, like with Steam Items API, and there are API, EVE Online has something like that. So I guess my point is that it depends on how you view the purpose of the blockchain for that. But I'd say decentralized, fully on-chain gaming, I'm not super bullish on. And I'm very bullish on the Deepin category, just as a whole. And I like that stuff just partly given my background in commodities. A lot of those guys come from a commodities background, so we can nerd out on power and oil rigs and stuff like that. And they often don't come from a crypto background. So that's our opportunity at Eclipse to be those infrastructure experts and tell them what's really not needed or what's the right construction given what they're building.
So most bearish, I might say something like real world assets, not because I actually think that it will, I think it's like a very good use case. I guess what I worry about is like, it just seems like it's going to have a lot of like regulatory sort of like headwinds, and like that's, you know, in DeFi in general, like the regulatory side of it is going to be, I think, really challenging until we get like clarity and we can like be above board, and like then we'll be able to actually onboard people and scale it up. But it's like going to be a challenge, and I think real world assets are really good, like within DeFi, are like specifically really challenging for that exact reason. And most bullish on, I don't know, kind of like either social or gaming. I feel like there's something there. There's like a virality in social apps and gaming apps that, you know, if someone can crack the code, I think it could blow up overnight. And like, you know, things like friend.tech, which is kind of trending right now, is a good example of how like there's that built-in virality. I mean, like most of those apps so far like kind of like blossom and fade, but like someone might actually get it to the point where it like blossoms and is able to like sustain and continue growing. And so that's where I feel like mass adoption is most likely to come from right now.
That's a really good point. On RWAs, sometimes I feel like it's kind of like the idea of putting an encyclopedia, like when the internet was made, taking a meat space encyclopedia and just putting it on the internet. It's not leaning into what makes the internet great. And similarly, taking real world assets and putting them on chain. It's like there's so many other things you can do on chain that are interesting. You should maybe lean into that. And I feel like people in bear markets always come back to the same concepts, whether it's real world assets or formerly known as securities tokens, which was a horrible name, or whether it's like assessing Web3 companies as if they're Web2 companies and trying to model out their ARR, when it's like that's not the right way to be thinking about it. And in that same vein, I'm very bearish on social applications that don't lean into financialization. That's why, I mean, I love that FriendTech was so polarizing. People are like, oh, it's the worst parts of crypto. Counterpoint is that it's actually the best parts. It's taking financialization and applying it into this gamified social experience that has built-in virality, as Nick said. So I think leaning into those aspects of crypto is going to be much more fruitful than trying to reject them.
Okay, that's a great answer. Last question. What is something you've completely changed your mind on since starting in crypto?
The settlement piece is one thing. I used to think, because people cite it so often. Everyone wants to be a settlement layer. Settlement's so important. Just over the last 6 months, just everything that I've looked into, and even John Charves' piece, all this was very damaging to my concept of settlement. And I'm just, anything that describes itself as a settlement layer, I'm very suspicious of at this point. So that's probably the biggest thing. And then, I mean, I started in crypto during like peak bull market. My first project was on the Terra blockchain. So honestly, it's just my view has completely changed. It's hard to even come up with things that were the same from when I first started.
For me, you know, this is particularly embarrassing, but like when I was building Harmony and in general, when I was like first learning about blockchains, I didn't actually go deep enough into fundamentals. And frankly, I didn't really even realize that verifiability was actually the source of the security of a chain. Like I didn't understand the role and importance of full nodes. Like, and I think this is a really widespread misconception. And some people, even when they understand the role of full nodes, they still somehow like cling on to this other idea of what blockchains are for. And like that it's okay to trust the validators. Like, because that was kind of my mental model, was like, and then if you think about it, like sharding itself never solves that problem. It's like you're just trusting the validators on the shard. You're making this root assumption that all the validators that are participating in the chain are honest. And like that is just fundamentally not what blockchains are for. And if they were, then you know, we would just, why not just have consortiums, and like why would we need a blockchain? Like we just have a bunch of Web2 companies run all these decentralized services, right? So I didn't understand that for a really long time. And it wasn't until like really getting deep in the weeds into Celestia and Lazy Ledger and Rollups and everything that I was like, oh wow, my eyes sort of opened to it. And I was like, oh my God, okay, wow. Like I've been just like totally misunderstood what's really going on here. And I think we need to do a lot more work to educate people and like kind of like reconnect to the core principles of crypto from the very beginning. And there's a lot of work to be done on that.
That's a really good point. Like if you ask a random person on the street, or when I started in crypto, certainly before really like reading up on this stuff, if you ask them if most of Bitcoin's overpowered, can Bitcoin steal your funds? They'd probably answer yes. They'd probably assume, oh, that's what the honest majority assumption means, 51% attack. That's not possible. Like that's just not how the blockchain works.
Yeah, it's really funny. I can feel so dumb in this space, but then I can feel like everyone else is so dumb, even though we're so smart, because we're like, oh, we discovered intents, or like, are rollups real? Like we discover, like we talk about these things that seem so obvious and like, you know, a 5th grade level when you're looking back at it. But obviously it's extremely complicated. And last point on the settlement issue, we just had Anatolian, and he's probably one of the few people that probably even 2 years ago was talking about how settlement's not an afterthought, but how it's not near as valuable as what people talk about. He's like, that's not the fun part. But guys, thanks so much for coming on. I think it's really exciting, Nick, what you're doing with Celestia, and also Neel building out the SVM. And I think together it's fun how you can work together, but also like not only does Ethereum benefit from this, but Solana can, and then obviously all these app chains in the future. So thanks so much for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you guys so much. I have a lot of respect for the Solana community and what you guys are building, and looking forward to this modularism, not maximalism thing where we all can benefit from each other, like you were just saying. So
yeah, and we're going to be working hard to push adoption of the SVM to the Ethereum community. We're really excited to be partnering with a bunch of Solana projects on this launch that we're pushing pretty soon. A bunch of infrastructure projects and wallets and stuff like that. So if you're a project in the Solana community, appreciate you reaching out for anyone in the audience.
Sweet, guys. All right, we'll talk to you next time.